again, it's the outsider perspective, because we were living right in the center of Lyon, and we could be friends with our baker, and became very close friends, and went to his daughter's wedding in Beaujolais, and you know, this 24-hour nonstop incredible wedding, and we could be friends with the kind of, you know, the haute bourgeois. Lyon is a very much of a class-oriented society. It's much more of an old-fashioned French city even now, because of the people we had known through the lab and whatnot.
So
and
you were like Faith, moving.
So we were moving through all of these different circles. We would be with you know, the silk manufacturers and champagne receptions, and then we'd be in Beaujolais with onion soup, and it was marvelous. And that book, I mean, I adored writing that book.
Lyon,
so I put everything in.
Is a silk capital.
Yeah.
Is that where they invented the jacquard?
Yes,
the jacquard?
the loom. Yep, that's where the loom with the first computer, essentially, because they used punch cards to make the designs.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How fascinating. When was that?
Oh, this was well before the French Revolution, so, you know,
really long time.
Yeah, 1600s, whatever. And in Lyon, they have these what are called traboules, these long tunnels that go from what were the silk workers, well, I mean, awful places where they had the looms and the clack, like the British mills, essentially. The noise must have been horrific, and these tunnels that went down to the water, you know, so that the silk would never be, if God forbid, if it rained, you know, so that they could go in all weather, to bring it directly to the ships. That's how. And then during the Second World War, the French resistance used this network of tunnels, and I used them in the book.
Well, of course you did.
Yeah, of course. How could I? I mean, I loved going through all of those triboules. In the daytime, you don't go at night in the triboules.
So you wrote that book, though, later from
yes,
what?
I wrote
from
that book.
Journals and things?
I kept, that was the one thing I would love to be a journal keeper, you know, who was it? Vita Sackville-West every day in her leather-bound journal. I would love to be able to do that. The only time I have been disciplined, and I just felt this is too amazing an experience, and the people we were meeting and the things, so all the time we were there, I kept a journal every day. And I wrote the book from those journals.
Do you feel tempted to mine that again and do another one?
I looked at those journals recently because I had forgotten someone's name, something that seems to be occurring with great frequency, and I went back to look for the person's name, and I was reading through, and I was thinking, you know, this would be sort of fun, and I thought, I don't know, maybe it even would be fun to do as nonfiction, because there were, you know...
There are so many memoirs that have come out,
because there's so many memoirs, and just such amazing things happen to us.
And Lyon is not, there's a lot of Tuscany. I am wild for a new book called En route Tatin, which is Normandy.
Oh, I haven't read this yet.
Wonderful
someone
book.
else
You will
recommended
truly
that.
enjoy
I will
it.
love that, yeah.
An American woman who studies cooking in France and works in Normandy, and she and her husband eventually buy what turns out to have been an old convent and restore it and live in this village in Normandy. And now she's become, I gather, successful enough to be running cooking classes and, you know, writing books and so forth. Her name is Susan Loomis.
Okay, I have to look for that.
Wonderful book. I loved every
I was always
minute.
stunned by, well, my friend Michelle in particular, who was, they had lived in Cambridge for a year when her husband was the postdoc, and so we got to be very, very close friends. And I would look in her refrigerator, and of course, you know, they're just about this size. They're like what kids take to college. And the apartment where we were was sans ascenseur. There was no, and I had this two-year-old, and it was something like 105 stone circular stairs going up a very old place. But she would open this refrigerator, and there would be nothing in it. I could see really nothing, and then she would just turn out these wonderful meals. Just throwing together. Yes, and I was living right by the big market, so I would see Paul Bocuse, and he would have the people behind him pushing the carts, and he would point to this melon and that melon, and you know, it was wonderful. It was great.
It is wonderful. I noticed that even in England when I go to visit friends, those little bitty, what we would think of as like a bar refrigerator, more often is the rule. And then, but the reason is that you go down every day, you go round the shops, as the British say, and you go to the butcher, and you go here and there, and so you don't don't really store.
Yeah.
Fish,
Yeah.
you know, was always delivered to be
yes,
fresh.
and there were so few Americans. In fact, I don't think we ever met any Americans that year. There were a few British people. I joined the British Library because I got desperate for, you know, I was going to all of the used books. They had lots and lots of old bookstores, and I was reading anything written in English. I read some of the most peculiar things that you ever can imagine. But then I found out that the British consulate had a library, of course, and this martinet of a woman gave me a temporary membership in that, so then I was all right.
What fun, though, to have an excuse to read whatever you wanted.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
you did do another book abroad, which was The Body in the Fjord.
The Body
now,
in the Fjord.
You
yeah.
are Scandinavian?
My grandparents were from Norway, and my mother was born in this country, but there was always a lot of going back and forth, and cousins and whatnot. And even though my grandmother wanted her children to grow up speaking English, she did not speak Norwegian to them. And my mother learned Norwegian as an adult, not as a child. And the first trip I made to Norway was in 1954 on, you know, the Oslo Fjord. You went by boat. Somehow my mother, you know, she just had this longing to go, and my grandmother, all her life, you know, wanted to go back and never. She made trips back, but it was never possible. The time when she left, she and her sister left. It was a terrible scourge of tuberculosis in Norway, and also so many men had been lost at sea. And the economy was terrible. This is in the late 1800s, and both parents died, and the oldest sister said to the 15 and 16-year-old, the two girls, you're going to have to go to America. And of course they didn't speak English, and so this 15-year-old and 16-year-old went on a boat and, you know, ended up in New York. And my grandmother worked for the family of the editor of the New York Sun, and his wife taught her English. But there was this in Brooklyn, big Norwegian community, and she met my grandfather there. Even though they were from the same village in Norway, they hadn't met there. So there was always this back and forthing. And let's see, it's about 6 years ago, my mother is now quite elderly, and I realized, you know, that if she really wanted to make a trip, and that I, of course, would have to go with her. So she and her sister, her youngest sister, and I, the three of us went. And it was wonderful. And
well, it's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it.
I put everything aside. I was writing a different book at the time, and I put it aside when I got home, and I wrote this. So that book is a bit based on, it's pretty much the tour, because I had never been, even though I'd been to Norway a number of times, I'd only been to the East Coast, and I hadn't seen the fjords and the glacier. And
which are magnificent. We were there a few years ago, having started at the top and come down from. It was gorgeous. But the food in there also, are those primarily family recipes?
Those are all family recipes. Those are recipes I grew up with. I mean, that's my mother learned. Obviously, she learned to cook. My mother is an artist and was never interested in cooking. She one time told me that when she realized how many meals she was going to have to turn out before we were sort of all grown up, she just about dissolved in tears. But you know, she did. You know, she was a very good plain cook. But we did eat a lot of fish, and she made a lot of the things that her mother had made. Then that's what she.
Well, I would imagine that pudding, because you know, you do, what was it, like book 3, where you began to include recipes?
I think book 4, yeah.
Book 4, in the actual published book, that must present you with a whole host of problems.
It does present a whole, because they have to be, they're not Faith Fairchild recipes, they're not caterer recipes. If you hired a caterer who, you know, presented you with, you know, the recipes that I generally put in the books, they wouldn't be very flamboyant or I mean, they'd be tasty, but they wouldn't be what you'd pay a caterer for. Because I decided I wanted people to be able to really make the things in the book, not look at them and think, oh, this is so hard, I would never make these.
Sure.